Expensive? Cheap? Mid-range? I just gave you 3 categories that are not supposed to overlap. But in this video, they do. Because the watches I'm about to show you completely blur the line between price and perception. You're going to see pieces that look expensive, feel premium, but don't actually belong in that category. And the craziest part, if I didn't tell you the price, you probably wouldn't guess it. So today, I'm showing you 10 watches that look way more expensive than they should. And by the end of this, you won't even know what category they belong to anymore. Let's start. Number 1, and this is where Seiko starts doing things most brands at this price don't even attempt. This is the Seiko Presage Urushi dial. At first glance, it looks simple, but the dial is made using traditional Japanese Urushi lacquer, a technique that takes multiple layers and long drying times to achieve that deep black finish. And that's what makes it different. Under light, the dial doesn't just reflect, it has a depth you usually only see on much higher-end watches. The design stays minimal, clean markers, sharp hands, and a layout that keeps the focus entirely on the dial. Everything feels intentional. The case is stainless steel with a polished finish, around 40 millimeters, making it easy to wear in both casual and formal settings. On the wrist, it feels light, balanced, and refined. Inside, you get Seiko's automatic movement with around 41 hours of power reserve, reliable and built for everyday use. But the real value here isn't the movement, it's the craftsmanship, because watches using Urushi lacquer are usually found in much higher price ranges. And that's where the perception shifts. Because this isn't just good for the price, it's a watch using a traditional hand-applied technique at a level where you don't expect to see it. And that's exactly why it takes the first spot on this list. Number 2, and this is where Seiko does something you almost never see at this price. This is the Seiko Presage Arita porcelain dial. At first glance, it looks clean, but that dial isn't standard. It's made using Arita porcelain, a traditional Japanese material that's been used for over 400 years. And that changes everything, because instead of a flat white dial, you get a surface that has a natural, slightly warm tone with a depth you don't get from painted dials. It reflects light softly, giving the watch a more refined, almost handmade feel. The design stays minimal, blue hands, clean numerals, and just enough detail to highlight the dial without overpowering it. Everything feels balanced. The case sits around 40 millimeters with a polished finish that keeps the watch elegant and wearable. On the wrist, it feels smooth and composed. Inside, you get Seiko's automatic movement with around 41 hours of power reserve, reliable and easy to live with. But again, this watch isn't about specs. It's about material, because porcelain dials are usually found on much more expensive watches. And that's where it stands out, because you're getting a traditional craft in a watch that doesn't feel like it should be in this price range. And that's exactly why it takes the second spot on this list. Number 3, and this is where Seiko focuses on precision and detail. This is the Seiko Presage Sharp-Edged series. At first glance, the dial already feels different. That texture isn't random. It's inspired by a traditional Japanese pattern called asanoha, a geometric design used for centuries, and under light it creates sharp reflections that give the watch a much more premium look. The case design matches that idea. Flat surfaces, defined edges, and a mix of brushed and polished finishes that give it a more modern, almost architectural feel. It doesn't look soft, it looks precise. The case sits around 39.3 millimeters with a slim profile that wears comfortably on most wrists. On the wrist, it feels balanced and structured. Inside, you get Seiko's 6R35 automatic movement with around 70 hours of power reserve, which is well above average at this price. And that's important, because you're not just getting design, you're getting strong specs too. Sapphire crystal, solid build, and everyday reliability. And this is where it stands out, because this doesn't feel like a typical dress watch. It feels sharper, more modern, more complete than expected. And that's exactly why it earns its place on this list. Number 4, and this is where things get seriously balanced. This is the Tissot Gentleman Powermatic 80 Silicium. At first glance, it looks simple, But that's exactly the point, because this watch is all about proportions and everyday versatility. The dial is clean, applied markers, sharp hands, and a layout that works in almost any situation, casual or formal. Nothing feels out of place. The case is around 40 millimeters with a brushed and polished finish that gives it a subtle premium look without trying too hard. On the wrist, it feels light, comfortable, and extremely wearable. But the real value is inside. You get the Powermatic 80 movement, with up to 80 hours of power reserve. And more importantly, a silicon-balanced spring, which means better resistance to magnetism, more stability, and improved long-term reliability. And that's something you don't always get at this price. Sapphire crystal, solid bracelet, and Swiss build quality complete the package. And this is where it stands out, because this doesn't rely on design tricks. It just does everything right. Clean, reliable, well-built. And that's exactly why it earns its place on this list. Number 5, and this is where vintage design meets modern execution. This is the Baltic MR Classic. At first glance, it feels different. Smaller case, thinner profile, and a design that clearly takes inspiration from vintage dress watches. But that's exactly what makes it stand out. The dial is clean and detailed. Sector-style layout, applied markers, and finishes that play with light in a subtle way. Nothing feels loud, but everything feels intentional. The case is around 3.6 millimeters with a thin profile that sits very close to the wrist. And that size is important because it gives the watch a more classic, refined presence, something you don't see often today. On the wrist, it feels light, elegant, and extremely comfortable. Inside, you get a Japanese automatic movement, Mido 8315, with around 60 hours of power reserve. Reliable, simple, and easy to maintain. Sapphire crystal, solid finishing, and strong attention to detail complete the package. And this is where it stands out, because instead of trying to look modern and bold, it goes in the opposite direction. Smaller, cleaner, more refined. And that gives it a kind of presence that feels far more expensive than it should. And that's exactly why it earns its place on this list. Number 6, and this is where minimal design becomes the main advantage. This is the Mido Baroncelli Heritage. At first glance, it looks extremely simple, but that simplicity is exactly what gives it that refined, high-end feel. The dial is clean. Slim markers, Dauphine hands, and a layout that focuses entirely on balance and proportion. Nothing extra, nothing distracting. The case is around 39 millimeters with a very thin profile that sits close to the wrist. And that thinness matters because it gives the watch a more elegant presence, something you usually associate with higher-end dress pieces. On the wrist, it feels light, smooth, and very comfortable. Inside, you get a Swiss automatic movement with up to 80 hours of power reserve, which is impressive for a watch in this category. Sapphire crystal, solid finishing, and classic proportions complete the design. And this is where it stands out, because instead of trying to impress with complexity, it focuses on execution. Clean, balanced, understated. And that level of control is what makes it feel more expensive than it is. And that's exactly why it earns its place on this list. Number 7, and this is where classic design meets modern reliability. This is the Tissot Heritage Visodate. At first glance, it feels very traditional. Simple dial, vintage-inspired layout, and a clean design that doesn't try to follow trends. But that's exactly what makes it work. The dial is well-balanced. Slim markers, curved hands, and a day-date display that adds functionality without making the watch feel busy. Everything feels controlled. The case is around 40 millimeters with a slim profile and polished finish that gives it a refined look on the wrist. It's easy to wear, easy to style, and fits almost any situation. Inside, you get a Swiss automatic movement with around 80 hours of power reserve. Reliable, consistent, and built for everyday use. Sapphire crystal and solid finishing complete the package. And this is where it stands out. Because instead of trying to be modern or bold, it focuses on timeless design, something that doesn't go out of style. And that's exactly what makes it feel more expensive than it is. And that's why it earns its place on this list. Number 8, and this is where Seiko proves how far dial design can go at this price. This is the Seiko Presage Cocktail Time. At first glance, the dial immediately stands out. And that's not by accident. The texture is inspired by cocktail glass patterns, designed to reflect light in different directions depending on the angle. And that's what gives it that dynamic look. It's not just shiny, it changes. The dial comes in multiple colors, but they all share that same depth and reflective quality. The design stays clean. Sharp hands, applied markers, and a layout that keeps everything balanced. Nothing feels crowded. The case is around 40 to 41 millimeters, with a polished finish that adds to the overall elegance. On the wrist, it feels light and comfortable, with a more dress-oriented presence. Inside, you get Seiko's automatic movement with around 41 hours of power reserve. Simple, reliable, and easy to maintain. Hardlex crystal and solid construction complete the watch. And this is where it stands out, because at this price, you rarely see this level of dial execution. It feels more expressive, more detailed, more premium than expected. And that's exactly why it earns its place on this list. Number 9, and this is where things start to feel almost unfair for the price. This is the Orient Bambino. At first glance, it looks like a classic dress watch. Clean dial, slim markers, and a design that feels much more expensive than you'd expect. But that's what makes it interesting, because this is one of the few watches at this price that gives you a true mechanical experience. The dial is simple. Depending on the version, you get Roman numerals or minimal markers, all paired with a slightly domed design that adds depth. And that domed crystal makes a difference. It gives the watch a more vintage, refined look, something usually found in higher-end pieces. The case is around 40 to 42 millimeters, with a thin profile that sits comfortably on the wrist. On the wrist, it feels light, elegant, and easy to wear. Inside, you get Orient's in-house automatic movement with around 40 hours of power reserve, reliable, simple, and one of the best value movements in this range. Mineral crystal, solid build, and classic proportions complete the watch. And this is where it stands out. Because for this price, you're not supposed to get this level of design and mechanics together. But somehow, you do. And that's exactly why it earns its place on this list. Number 10, and this is where everything comes together. This is the Tissot PRX Quartz. At first glance, it already looks expensive. The integrated bracelet, the slim case, and the overall design give it a presence you usually see in much higher-end watches. And that's what makes it stand out. The dial is clean and balanced, sunburst or textured depending on the version, but always sharp and controlled. Nothing feels overdone. The case is around 40 millimeters with a thin profile that wears extremely well on the wrist. On the wrist, it feels smooth, solid, and very well finished. The bracelet is a big part of that. Tight links and clean transitions that feel more premium than expected. Inside, you get a Swiss quartz movement. Accurate, reliable, and easy to live with. And this is where everything connects. Because after seeing all 10, you realize something simple. Price doesn't always match perception. Some watches just deliver more. Clean, sharp, surprisingly premium. And that's exactly why it's the perfect way to close this list.